Hey everyone, it's Jason Pannone, Head of Reference and Cultural Assets Manager here at the East Hartford Public Library. For this installment of Raiders of the Lost Archive, I'm going to show you some tobacco collecting cards that we have in our collection. They're kind of unusual in that they show military subjects, specifically some of the generals and admirals and captains from the Spanish American War, as well as some of the battleships and other capital ships that were involved in that conflict. They're kind of unusual. I showed them to an appraiser a few years ago, and he thought that they were quite rare, that he had never seen them. I've never been able to find much about them. So, with that, I will take a look at them and show them to you. We'll go through each of them as a group, the persons first, and then we'll go through and look at the ships. Here's a picture showing all six of the cards with some of the Navy and Army personnel who were involved in the Spanish American War. The first card we'll look at is that of Commodore, later Admiral George Dewey. Dewey led a squadron against the Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor in what's called the Battle of Manila Bay, where his small squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet and helped to secure the Philippines for the United States. This card shows Commodore, later Rear Admiral Winfield Scott Schley. Commodore Schley commanded the American forces rather, in Cuba and helped to liberate Cuba from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War. Captain Robley D. Evans, later Admiral, also known as Fighting Bob Evans, was captain of the USS Iowa, which was a battleship. This is the predecessor to the famous World War II battleship, during the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, which also, like Admiral Schley, was part of what liberated Cuba from Spanish rule. Evans had quite a colorful career. He was known for his penchant for profanity. In fact, he was actually chastised in a letter to the New York Times by a congregational pastor in Litchfield, Connecticut. Evans held quite a number of positions and is quite an interesting character. So I will put some information about him, along with everybody else that I'm going to talk about, in the description of this podcast. Charles Dwight Sigsbee was a captain and later a rear admiral in the United States Navy. He had, in addition to his naval duties, he also was a noted early oceanographer and hydrographer. Sigsbee is best known as being the captain of the cruiser USS Maine, which blew up in Havana Harbor in 1898 and basically was the start of the Spanish-American War. And there's kind of an interesting connection to East Hartford in that we own, apparently, a fragment of the USS Maine. I've got a piece of metal, which I'll show when I'm finished narrating this, that has a label attached to it that says, "Piece of the Battleship Maine," donated by the Sons of Veterans, which I'm assuming is veterans of the Spanish-American War. I have no idea if this is true, but it's kind of an interesting piece in our collection that it's kind of neat to have. General Joseph Wheeler, who was Theodore Roosevelt's superior at the Battle of San Juan Hill, had a very interesting life. His military career actually began before the Civil War when he was involved in the Mexican-American War. He later joined the Confederacy and became leader of several cavalry regiments that engaged Union forces. He was captured after the war, served some time in prison, and then later became a congressman. When the Spanish-American War broke out, he volunteered to serve and was accepted as a general. So he served both in the Confederate and the Union Army. And, like I said, was Roosevelt's superior at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Kind of an interesting story. So check out what I've posted in the description to learn more. The The colorful and larger-than-life Theodore Roosevelt needs no introduction. It's kind of interesting in the library, in our rare books room, we have a large collection of Roosevelt's complete works. I read one a few years ago, which was really kind of interesting because he dedicates the book to his gun and lists, all 300 creatures that he had killed with it. And yet there are these beautiful lyrical passages on conservation and preservation of the wilderness that just stand in stark contrast. It's kind of interesting. I've always found Roosevelt to be a fascinating character. So I will put some stuff up in the description so that you can check out more about him. This picture shows all the cards of the capital ships that are in this particular collection. The ships include the USS Baltimore, which was a cruiser, and the USS Penobscot. I think it's hard to read the writing, it's so faded on the card. The battleships Iowa and Indiana, the cruiser Olympia, the battleship New York, and the cruiser, I think, the Charleston. The Baltimore and the Olympia were part of Commodore Dewey's squadron at the Battle of Manila Bay. And in fact, the Olympia was Dewey's flagship, and you can still see it in Philadelphia. The Indiana was a battleship commanded by Robley Evans, and later he would command the Iowa, which the predecessor to the famous Iowa of World War II, and the New York, which was his ship at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. So it's really neat to see these ships. Now you might be asking where these cards came from. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, these cards were included in packets of cigarettes, cigars, and whatever as collectibles. We've got actually 2 collectible albums in our collection that are, some of them are just breathtaking, the art and the color that's included in them. Others are far more simpler, like these. These were marketed to not only grown men and women, but to children as well. And this is where baseball cards that were included in packets of gum, as it became less acceptable to market tobacco products to young children. So this card here that you see shows the company that gave this out with these particular cards out with their product. This is not a complete set, I don't think, because we do have 2 copies of the Dewey card, and there's also 4 of the Indiana. So I don't know if there were more cards. There might have been. Like I said, I've not been able to find anything on this particular set. So if anyone does find anything, I would be very curious to know more about them. So there you go. Thanks for listening and watching. This is Jason Pannone, Head of Reference and Cultural Assets Manager at the East Hartford Public Library. Just reminding you to keep washing your hands, practice safe social distancing, and we'll see you next time. Bye.